You're listening to Puma Podcast.
Hi, I'm Marco Azurin, Puma Podcast for Teka Teka. Manila residents seeking horror stories this Halloween need not look farther than the walls of Intramuros. Known for its daytime charm, the heart of Old Manila tells a different story when the sun goes down. Intramuros has become associated with tales of paranormal sightings enough to keep you up at night. But tour guides like Benjamin Canapi reveal that the true horror is not in these ghost stories, but in the history within these walls. For today's episode of Teka Teka, we'll be sharing an extract from the Halloween episode of What's Up, Araling Panlipunan Rebooted. In this episode of the History Pod, hosts Sab Schnabel and Siege Tantenko Malolos spend one night in Intramuros, learning more about its dark history and what this means for today's generation of Filipinos. Due to the graphic stories of war, violence, and death, listener discretion is advised.
So my name is Benjamin Canapi and I'm the head tour guide of Wonder Manila. On behalf of our group, thank you very much for being here. Welcome to One Night in Intramuros. This is a dark history tour of the walled city of Intramuros. So this is not your typical tour that we stand in front, for example, this one, and talk about Baroque architecture, Ionic pillars, and so on and so forth. We're going to be talking about darker, more violent stories in this tour. It's not specifically a ghost tour. It's a dark history tour, although we will be talking about a few ghost stories here and there.
We'll be talking about a lot of horror in this episode, and a lot of it happened in what is arguably the most horrifying event in our history.
The Battle of Manila, which began in February 1945 and raged on for several weeks.
It's important to understand the context of when this was during the war.
See, this wasn't the beginning of the war. It was the end, when the Japanese already knew that they were losing. They were ordered to retreat.
Unfortunately, if the Japanese soldiers were to go down, they were going to take down as many Filipinos as they could with them.
The Americans were coming, and the Japanese were going full scorched earth.
And so Japanese soldiers set fire to the beautiful city that was once called the Paris of the East and began massacring the Filipinos who lived in it.
The chaos and fear was unimaginable. No matter where you turned, there was violence in the streets.
So you're now standing in front of the Memorial Manila 1945. This memorial was actually unveiled in this location back in 1995 to commemorate the lives lost during the Battle of Manila, an estimated 100,000 civilians. The Battle of Manila was a battle waged between American soldiers who were more than motivated to defeat the Japanese occupying it and against the Japanese soldiers, around 16,000 of them, that were still holding on to Manila, prepared to defend it to the death, whether that was a good idea or not. Now, the Americans were not exactly fresh. No, they didn't just land in Manila and started attacking. They were campaigning along the country for around 6 months. They were running out of ammunition and supplies as well. So, they made the decision to start bombarding Manila with artillery, howitzers, cannon fire, and all of that, which resulted in the destruction of around 60% of Manila. The Japanese, somewhere between fighting the Americans and running away for their lives, was ordered to kill and massacre as many civilians as they could. In fact, most of the massacres happened between February 9 to 13, 1945. The period of time is now referred to as the Manila Massacres.
Even though he does believe in ghosts, Ben says he doesn't believe in all ghost stories. As a history enthusiast, he prefers to do research. But when a ghost story lines up with the history of a place, that's when he starts to believe.
One of our first stops was in front of the San Ignacio Church, where Ben told us about his friend who could sense spirits.
Example, this corner here of the mission house, my friend saw around a dozen Filipino men kneeling down, as if they were blindfolded, as if their hands were tied behind their backs. And there was a weird energy, almost malevolent, angry, that was revolving around them. Now, before my friend could define anything else that she was seeing, she suddenly lurched forward and fell down. When we picked her up, we asked her if she was okay, what happened to her. And then she basically tells us, can we go somewhere else? Then I'll tell you. Okay, so we go to the next block. And then she tells us, while she was talking about that, somebody hit her in the back of the head. Upon doing research in the area, we do know that around 20 bodies were found in front of this area. We don't necessarily...
We wondered, why was there no marker talking about the massacre?
And the bodies were found after 1945, which would make them massacre victims. So you would think, massacre victims, why aren't they listed? Why isn't the San Ignacio Church listed as a massacre site? Because 20 bodies is too little.
That's how many massacres took place during the Battle of Manila.
When the Japanese found out that the hospital was treating American soldiers, they stormed the hospital and killed over 100 doctors, nurses, and patients. Then they dumped all the bodies into the ravine beside the hospital. By the time the last few bullets and artillery shells were fired onto what we now call the National Museum of Archaeology and the National Museum of Natural Science, because those were the last stands of the Japanese. On March 3, 1945, over 100,000 Filipino civilians were killed. When we say that the dead were blanketing the streets, that is not overstating it.
It was already dark when we got to the Lyceum of the Philippines University. It's one of several colleges inside the walls of Intramuros, including Mapua University and Colegio de San Juan de Letran.
Students, teachers, faculty, staff will attest to have seen this phenomenon at least like once. The most popular ghost story that the Lyceum has is basically nurses covered in blood running down the corridors. Specifically nurses, okay? Now, I actually kind of believe, or at the very least plausible, the story. Why? Because if they said students or teachers running down the aisle, that's expected because it's a school. But nurses, that's kind of specific. And before any of you ask, no, there's no nursing courses. No, the nurses have something to do with what this place was. So before this was the Lyceum of the Philippines, this was the San Juan de Dios Hospital. It's the oldest hospital in the Philippines. This hospital was functional during 1945, during the events of the battle. This hospital is also a massacre site because a number of doctors and nurses and patients were also killed here, and then the survivors were rounded up and brought to the ruins of the Santo Domingo Church. And then the coup de grace was when the Americans started their bombardment of Intramuros on February 16, the areas closest to that bombardment were the first to be destroyed. So everything that you're seeing here was basically wiped out. Now that you know the history, the story of ghostly nurses running down the corridors makes a little bit more sense.
In some cases, these stories are the only reminders left of what used to be in Intramuros before it was destroyed or just wore away over time.
Which makes the structures that remain standing even more important for remembering our history. On through Plaza Roma and the Manila Cathedral, we made our way to Fort Santiago, which Ben calls the most haunted spot in Intramuros.
Sometime during the Battle of Manila, the Japanese started burning down the walled city. So the houses, which at the time was still made out of wood, mostly, started catching fire easily. So in the chaos, the Japanese started herding a total of 1,400 men. They captured them, took them away, and dragged them all the way to Fort Santiago. Now, presumably, some of these men didn't even make it all the way here. Some of them were killed in other areas, like, I guess, San Ignacio. Most likely in Palacio de Gobernador was part of that group that was dragged here. Generally speaking, the 1,400 people that were dragged to Fort Santiago were never seen again. So they were killed in pockets all around the area. So 40 bodies here, 50 bodies there, everywhere that you could possibly kill people. You kill people here. That's why, for those who believe in this stuff, Fort Santiago is one of the more haunted areas of Intramuros.
Up until now, we visited historic structures in the middle of the urban community that Intramuros has become. You could pass by these churches and schools any day.
But you'd have to plan your visit to see this part of Intramuros. It's past the part of Fort Santiago that we're all familiar with, past the adobe walls and the moat.
I don't believe in ghosts, but I do believe in the heaviness of history. And Fort Santiago is one of those places where you feel the weight of so many stories bearing down on you.
We are right beside the Pasig River at this point. The river is literally on the edge of that wall over there. Meaning that the section is constantly in an area where there is constant water. It's never going to leave. So this chamber is always wet and damp and moist. The Japanese used this structure to imprison their prisoners of war. Sounds really impressive when you say it like that, oh, prisoners of war. Except, the Japanese would actually kill anybody who they suspect would be a rebel or a guerrilla or somebody who's actually dangerous. They would just kill you outright. There's no throwing you into prison, saying yung resources. They'll just shoot you in the head. So, who actually gets imprisoned here? People who commit minor crimes and misdemeanors. So, how minor is minor? Okay, jaywalking, selling contraband products, not bowing low enough to the Japanese soldiers, or failure to give your house or your car or your daughter to the Japanese when they asked you very nicely. Something to that effect. Now, the prison is only rated for 100 prisoners at a time. That's the humane amount. So obviously, because the Japanese were not humane in the country during that period of time, there would be between 500 to 1,000 prisoners at a time. And as you can imagine, the death toll during the occupation alone was already quite high because of people dying from diseases or lack of food or even lack of oxygen.
The dungeons of Fort Santiago were one place the Battle of Manila didn't touch, but not for a good reason.
When the Battle of Manila started, it is most likely that the Japanese captors simply threw away the key. Whoever were in the dungeon were going to be left in the dungeon and they were going to die in the dungeon slowly. So, the 600 bodies found there died due to starvation and lack of water and most likely due to diseases. Imagine you with 599 other prisoners in pitch darkness, with no food and water, with the certainty that you are going to die. The weakest prisoners would probably have died within the first 2 to 3 days. The Americans only attacked and liberated Fort Santiago on February 24, 1945. That is basically week 4. There were no survivors because they were too late.
I don't want to imagine, but it's true. It happened. Something so horrifying is real.
We still live in the legacy of the Battle of Manila. We need to face these stories because they are part of our stories.
They might be hard to tell and hard to hear, but they remind us that we are born of survivors.
We came from the people who survived this onslaught and came out stronger.
No matter how hard the horrors of war tried to erase the city from existence, we still managed to rebuild, to find a way back.
And how can you not love Manila more when you know the stories behind her scars?
Be sure to catch the full episode to hear interviews with other participants of the Dark History Tour, as well as an interview with tour guide Benjamin Canapi. Just search up WhatsApp, spelled WhatsApp, Araling Panlipunan Rebooted on your favorite podcast app. Again, I'm Marco Azurin. Today's episode was produced by myself and put together by Joe Salcedo. This extract from WhatsApp, Araling Panlipunan Rebooted, comes from an episode produced by Nina Toralba and edited by Joe Salcedo. Maraming salamat po.